Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. Today I'm going to talk to you about Parmenides and Zeno, the Eleatics, a fascinating pair of pre-Socratic philosophers who are hard to understand. I mean, they are sort of the epitome of people who say paradoxical and impossible sounding things, actually. I want to shed some light on what it is that they say, and they're also important for understanding Plato. This is a source of a lot of the framework that Plato has. So let's get to that right away. We're talking about, again, the Eleatics, and let me explain where they come from first. So I think actually the more I look at Greek philosophy, the more convinced I am that history and geography are very important for understanding. Oftentimes, in philosophy in general, oftentimes we get philosophical ideas and theses presented to us sort of in a vacuum. And philosophy is like art. It's really very much in the context of its time and its place. So it's important to take a look at that to understand what it is that we're looking at. So let's take a look at these fascinating Eleatics today. And let's first of all center ourselves with a little geography. When we say Magna Graecia in the 5th century, 6th and 5th century, we're talking about basically the Italian peninsula and Sicily, where there was extensive Greek colonization. This is sort of the westernmost frontier of the Greek-speaking lands, again, in the 500s and 400s, which of course is the age of Pericles and the Athenian Empire. Bounded on the east by the Ionian coast, and we have then that video on the on the Ionians, that is Anaximander and Heraclitus and Thales and the rest. So and then you see that the Greek peninsula just between those two. So geographically, we get a nice consistency with the ideological frame, where we get the Ionians, who are these naturalists, and the Eleatics, who are basically some kind of rationalists. So all right, let's get on with that then. Yeah, here we go. We get it's coming up. This is a difficult times. These are philosophers who live, as we say, in difficult times. It's the time of the Persian Empire putting pressure on the Greek-speaking lands, trying to bring the Greek-speaking lands under Persian dominance, which in fact led to the unification of the Greeks and the great 5th century. So as I say, second bullet point, you have Thales and Anaximander, Anaximenes and Heraclitus on this Ionian coast of Asia Minor, what is today Turkey, where they're exposed, of course, to all the ideas coming down through the Silk Road from far and away, from China, from India, from Persia, from Egypt. And what characterizes them is rejecting theistic and mythological explanations. Although I would also say there that they're not entirely secular people. I mean, and I think it's a little too fast to say that there aren't any sort of mythological or spiritual resonances. For example, in the Ionians' investigations into the primary elements, I think it's important to understand. One of the charms of ancient thought is that we don't have it compartmentalized into different sort of specific areas and topics the way it is in modern times. And so you really want to see and have an ear for these sort of resonances that are always kind of echoing around. Everything is the same: psychology, metaphysics, religion, astronomy, ethics, politics, all baked together in sort of one thing. So third bullet point then, in the West, the Eleatics, who we're going to talk about today, were a different sort of thing, but still something we associate with philosophy. Remember, the word philosophy in the ancient world is just knowledge producers. Philo de Sophia, love of Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. So again, right off the bat, we have to be careful not to take our sort of stereotypes and conceptions of what philosophy is today and project those onto these ancient thinkers. They are not people who make a distinction, for example, between science and philosophy. And when we look at the Ionians, for example, we're looking at sort of proto-scientists. The Eleatics are, first of all, significant in terms of kind of the sort of course of Western philosophy, in as much as they are the philosophers who say everything is not what it seems, the world isn't as it appears to be, and we can come to have understanding of the way the world is through reflection, through thinking about sort of logical necessity. So again, that's just that final fourth bullet point there. Summing that up, we want to be careful not to project too much of our own distinctions onto this. But starting with Plato, really, Plato sort of sets himself up as being between, and the way he puts it is sort of between Heraclitus and Parmenides, someone who was very interested in Heraclitus and the new science as a young man, Plato tells us, and then came to appreciate the insights of Parmenides as he matured, and as Plato himself matured as a philosopher. So first, let me just talk a little bit about Pythagoras. Pythagoras, originally from Ionia, but very much a figure in Magna Graecia. Pythagoras himself, a mysterious figure, but also his followers, the Pythagoreans, were essentially a sort of cultural and political party for a long, long time. And they had a big influence on things, and there were political upheavals involving the Pythagoreans. Even the Pythagoreans were a party that sort of thought that society should kind of be rationalized. Second bullet point, Plato and Parmenides both really clearly very much influenced by Pythagoras. Pythagoras' metaphysics, and here's a good example of this kind of lack of boundaries and distinctions between fields that we find in ancient thought, because Pythagoras thinks that the universe is composed really of number, it's composed by mathematics. Again, not making a distinction between the practice of mathematics and the practice of investigation into the physical world. As I say in that second bullet point, strikingly literal. So you have the integer of the one, again, just an integer. You know, usually if we put the name one on a number, we think of it as one in the sense of the first in the line of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3. But just think of the number as a generic notion. There's just the unit, and that corresponds with the point or with the atom. So very literally, again, for Pythagoras, the integer one, integers form the line forms the plane forms the solid, and so on. Number manifests as form. From the one come the many. You might want to look at the video in here on the taijitsu, the yin yang symbol, for a further discussion of this relationship between the one and the many, which is absolutely at the bottom of what Plato is always talking about in his metaphysics. So third bullet point there. You know, the idea for Plato anyway is that the soul participates in the one, and the body is our incarnation in the world of the many. Sorry, that happened again. We can see that bridge between Platonism, a transcendental theory that Plato has about the soul, and Hindu notions about the spirit or the soul, for example. Again, recognizably axial age thinking, that this kind of movement of civilization in the middle of the first millennium BCE was a kind of movement that the individual will transcend their own self-importance and come together through appreciation of the one. And that is, again, very much an axial age thought, and something that we see very clearly in Pythagoras. All right, so back to Parmenides then. Let's look at Parmenides' basic argument. Parmenides argues that anything that exists positively. So let's just think about that for a second. That is, we say that things are, and so the existence of an object, something exists. It exists positively. To say that something exists is entirely a positive notion. There's a lot of interesting discussion about this in Kant. It's something that is important to appreciate when we're looking at medieval proofs for the existence of God, for example, like the ontological proof, notably. But at Parmenides, he has a real clear sense of this, that existence is entirely a positive thing. There's nothing negative about existence at all. And so the conclusion is that there's nothing negative in existence at all. The human finitude is what leads us to posit negatives and negation, and to have negation as part of our linguistic practices. course, always here what's going on is this commuting between the one and the many. The equivocation is between the way we talk about things in the world of the multiplicity of the many, and the way that we talk about things when we're considering existence as a unity, as one thing. So, okay, and Heraclitus, right, says, well, look, the things are both, some things warmer than one thing, colder than another. So it's both warm and cold. Protagoras takes this up. Protagoras tells us the wind is cool to one person, warm to another person. So he develops this perspectival relativism from that. And this is this tendency that Plato is set against. So what does Parmenides do? He takes this idea that existence is entirely a positive thing. There's nothing negative in existence. And he applies it to ontology. One thing cannot not be, this is the last bullet point on the slide, one thing cannot not be another thing, because not being something just isn't a real property. It doesn't exist in existence, if you will. So there's only one thing, he says. Reflection on the one reveals that there's only one thing. His argument, again, coming from the positivity of existence. Neither can anything be divisible. There are no surfaces. Because a surface has parts, right? And parts are divisible. You can distinguish one from another. Neither can anything be different than it was. There isn't any change, because change would say that something isn't the way that it used to be. And again, these negations are illusions, according to Parmenides, illusions about fundamental reality, about real ontology. You can't be distinct coordinates. There isn't any space and time for the same reason that there aren't any surfaces. No contingency, only necessity. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. No imperfection, no limits, and so on. So again, giving us this picture of reality, a rationalist picture of reality, which is arrived at through reflection on the nature of existence and on the concept of negation. Okay, so this Parmenidean world then, again, that first bullet point, Parmenides, saying that the world is not as it appears. It's not as it appears to us who are incarnate in bodies. Again, straight ahead axial age thinking, common to Chinese thinking, Indian thinking, Persian thinking. And in fact, second bullet point, Parmenides posits the world can't even in principle be represented or experienced by embodied beings. Again, remember, it's not as if we could have some experience with our senses that's different than the one that we have. It's that we're talking about reality in the sense of a reality that it's not experienced individually by an individual body. And so this Parmenidean world can only be known indirectly through logical inference. The modern philosopher Immanuel Kant, third bullet point, remember, he's also reacting against it's the same story. It's the same culture war in modern philosophy as it is in the ancient world, exactly the same one. That is, reacting against Hume's secular empirical vision of a world that does not apparently contain a deity or freedom or values or mind separate from body and so on. Then Kant says, well, that cannot be, is the famous supposedly thing that Kant said reading Hume. And so Kant sets up a kind of system of mental representation. He says that one question we can ask is, what is necessary for experience to be possible? He says, well, the mind must have a conceptual structure. Again, this is very familiar. But notice Kant's very radical on that. Kant says that space and time are projections of the conceptual structure of the mind, that nomological causation, the multiplicity of objects. Kant says the multiplicity of objects is projection of conceptual structure of the mind. That is, the world of the many is a projection, a representation that is a product of this conceptual structure that the mind has. And so this leaves us with an implicit noumenal world. Kant says this atheistic secular science is a science of the phenomenal world, but real being is the noumenal world, just the same as Parmenides says. Kant warns us against trying to know about the noumenal world, although he wants himself to say a bunch of logically, rationally motivated things about it, a proof of the existence of God, for example. Others didn't take his warning. Schopenhauer, for example, is fascinated with this notion of the noumenal world. Last bullet point, more to the point, again, and remember Pythagoras, Parmenides describing the transcendental properties of mathematics. If we're looking for the thing that doesn't change, the thing that's indivisible, the thing that's a unity, the thing that's eternal, the thing that seems divine, it looks like it's mathematics that has all of those properties. And this is where Plato gets it from. Philosophy and ontology of mathematics is at the center of Plato's thinking. Plato's Academy followed the Pythagoreans in this. At the temple, at the votive worship ceremonies, and in ordinary training, both amongst the Pythagoreans and at Plato's Academy in Athens, people did geometrical proofs, they did logical proofs, because in doing those, people were contemplating these eternal transcendental forms that underlay the multiple world. And so, as Heraclitus says, the soul loves to become wet, but the dry soul is wisest and best. And the sacramental activity for these transcendentalists, the Pythagoreans and the Platonists, was doing these proofs using the mind, and so that the mind would transcend the body. Perhaps surprisingly, Parmenides is actually important in the progression of ancient Greek physics. Again, when there's a sort of basic problem there. As I said, there's an equivocation between talking about the world of the many and talking about the world of the one. And that was sort of somewhat passed over in terms of people taking Parmenides very seriously. In that first bullet point, you see the parenthesis there. Another interesting thing in Plato, there isn't much of a clear distinction between logical claims and physical claims. The logical claims are taken very literally to be reflecting facts about the physical world in the pre-Socratics as well as in the writings of Plato. So to explain Parmenides' influence then on the physicists, the later physicists like the atomists, Democritus and Empedocles, or Anaxagoras, the great systematic physicist who lived in Athens in the 5th century. 5th century thinkers understood Parmenides to show that matter doesn't come to be or pass away. Indeed, he says reality, existence doesn't come to be or pass away. And this sort of becomes a version of the principle of the conservation of matter. The fundamental being neither comes to be or passes away. So then when we look at these later 5th century physical systems, like the atomism of Democritus and Empedocles, we see that they want to talk about the rearrangement or the transformation of more basic kinds of matter into higher levels of organization and sophistication. And so this notion that nothing comes to be and passes away, and then Empedocles, for example, says that, well, all of the kinds of matter, all of the categories of matter are present in all things. The only difference is the way that things recombine and change. As Democritus says, you have these atoms swirling in the void. So this is then, again, to me, somewhat improbably, but nonetheless very real influence that Parmenides' thinking has on the physical theories of the cosmologists of the 5th century. Okay. And then Parmenides and modal logic, and this is one of the reasons why Parmenides is of interest to contemporary philosophers. Modality, necessity, contingency, possibility, impossibility. These are sort of the modal operators. We say about things that they have these modal properties. Some things are necessary, some things are contingent, some things are more probable, some things are more improbable, some things are impossible, some things are possible. It's possible that this is true. It's not possible that that thing is true. But thinkers, again, you could say philosophers, but this is a problem for people throughout sort of the course of Western thought, really were actually mostly skeptical about modality. Spinoza, for example, who thinks that the universe is both the mind and the body of God, doesn't think that, then he thinks that obviously if it's the mind of God, then everything is logically necessary. And so Spinoza's sort of version of Stoicism is this notion that, we are finite, and that's why it looks to us that things have modal properties, but really they don't. Similar to some elements in Hindu thought, again. And this is something that comes right up to the present, right up to the 19th century, when you finally get this notion of possible worlds modal logic, where you can sort of concretize everything by saying that you're kind of quantifying over sets of possible worlds, all of the possible worlds being identical kinds of worlds. Okay, so, and indeed, there is an interesting and elaborate metaphysical discussion in the late 20th century, for example, between David Lewis and Alvin Plantinga, about the implications of possible worlds modal logic. Parmenides, right there from the very beginning, saying, look, existence is a positive thing. There isn't any negativity in existence. And therefore, there really aren't any modal properties at all. Everything just has the same property of being what it is. That's the intuition. And it's an intuition that really stayed with rationalists like Spinoza, but also the empiricists like Hume would say, look, when you talk about modal properties, you're talking about something that's not observable. And Parmenides right onto this problem about modality. So as I say, that's one of the reasons Parmenides continues to be of interest to people today. And then Zeno. Zeno is the protege. Zeno's paradoxes often are presented because of Plato's criticism of the sophists. Oftentimes we're told about Zeno that he is just a sort of sophistical trickster who's showing us that he can argue that day is night, night is day, and up and down is up. That's really not, though, getting at what Zeno is all about. And I think it's also probably not really getting at Plato's appreciation of the Eleatics. Plato and Zeno, Parmenides and Zeno. In Plato's late dialogue, Parmenides, one of the most fascinating dialogues of Plato, we're told that the young Socrates met Parmenides and Zeno on occasion of their visit to Athens. The math really is pretty far-fetched on that. It probably isn't the case, but Plato has an interesting genre where all of the characters in his dialogues are real historical characters, but the dates and contexts of the people are something that he can play with. So why? I'll explain the paradoxes in a moment. I'm assuming that most of the readers have some notion of the paradox of the tortoise and the hare, for example. But first of all, why does he do it? Zeno is trying to defend Parmenides. Zeno is saying that you critics of Parmenides say that Parmenides is saying incoherent, paradoxical things when he talks about the world of the one. But Zeno's point with the paradox is to say that people are involved in incoherent and paradoxical things just as much when they talk about the world of the many. So last bullet point on the slide there, Zeno's 4 paradoxes: the impossibility of one thing moving across space. That's what we're going to talk about. That's called the dichotomy. The impossibility of one moving thing overtaking another in space. That's sort of the tortoise, the story of the tortoise and the hare that Aesop also, probably prior to this, makes into a moral story. The impossibility of one thing moving across time, that's called the arrow. And the impossibility of 2 moving things converging in time, that's called the stadium. It's very interesting. I'll only discuss this first spatial paradox, the one called the dichotomy, about division. So this is it. The argument that that motion is impossible. Again, I would tend to call this the professor on the floor, because I'm pretty sure for the last 1,000 years or so, professors have been presenting it this way. That is, if I wanted to walk across the floor to the other side of the classroom, I'd first have to, according to the paradox, I'd first have to cover the first part of the floor. And after that, but to get there, I'd have to cover the first quarter of the floor. But to get to where I was a quarter of the way across the floor, I'd have to cross the first eighth of the floor. Notice that every unit of measurement is being considered as one unit equivalent to the others. That is, the eighth is a unit equal to the half being a unit. This is part of the thinking. Remember Pythagoras, who said everything's composed of the integer, the one. So the argument then is that, after all, between any 2 numbers, there's an infinite set of numbers, including between any 2 of the infinite set of numbers between the first set of 2 numbers. And if they're all considered as equivalent to each other, each one is a unit, then indeed it looks like there's going to be an infinite number of steps between any 2 steps that I try to take. That's the substance of the paradox. And that's the reason why I'm going to have to go 16th, 32nd, 64th, etc. Okay, and I'm never going to get to the other side of the room. Last bullet point on the slide. It's important to appreciate that this is a satirical argument. He's not seriously saying that he can convince people that motion is impossible. That's that sort of interpretation, seeing him as just a flashy sophist. But Kant's not trying to produce knowledge about the phenomenal world of experience. That's why his incorporation into natural physics is an odd fit, because these physicists don't seem to recognize this equivocation between talking about the world of the many and talking about the world of the one. They don't recognize it. Nonetheless, it's important to appreciate that Parmenides did have this deep influence on Greek physics. So that's the paradox. That motion is impossible because all of the units are the same in the world of many, right? And so I'd have to cross one unit to get to another, but I have to cross the prior unit and so on. And we're talking about infinite sets, okay? Infinite sets that we get implicit in the notion of the whole numbers of the number sequence, right? It has in it implicit this notion of infinite sets. And so another question here is, do infinite sets exist in nature? And so just to end our presentation here, then I'll talk about Aristotle's diagnosis of this, which is really important because it's really important for understanding Aristotle. The basic discussion here is in Aristotle's Physics, which I commend to you. And so, all right, let's go over it. Aristotle does understand this axial age thinking. He does understand the concept or the idea that you might produce knowledge by contemplating the one, which is just a very common trope, for example, as I said, in Asian philosophy and cosmology. He's not obtuse about that. He understands what they're saying. It's only Aristotle, who would probably be in a biology department if he were alive today. He's very much a biological thinker. He says, well, that's all well and good, but I want to practice natural science. I want to talk about the nature of the physical reality that we experience. And he makes the point, again, in his Physics, that if we want to do that, if we want to do that kind of natural taxonomic science, then we're going to have what is usually attributed to Aristotle, which is the principle of the excluded middle, that is not P and not P. Everything is itself and not another thing, is the famous quotation from Aristotle. Again, he says that he's just making a decision. He's saying, this is the direction that I want to go in. I want to produce knowledge at that level, the level of the multitude. And in order to do that, then I just have to assume the distinctness of each individual thing. Not that he doesn't understand the transcendental exhortation to contemplate the one. He gets it. He understands what it is. It's only that that's not his bag. That's not what he wants to do. So what's the critique then of Zeno's paradoxes? It's that there's a fallacy of equivocation, in this case between division. So you've got this heuristic mathematical sense of division, in which you can say that the floor is 40 feet across, and you can say that I'm 6 feet tall, and you can further divide that into inches, both of those dimensions, the width of the floor and my height. And that's what Zeno is talking about. Zeno is saying by that, by the logic of that, when we're talking about, again, this heuristic conventional systems of measurement, motion is impossible. But notice, again, the fallacy of equivocation is when you use two words, the same word, it has two different meanings. And so you're using it in the first sense once, and then you smuggle in the second sense of the word. That's the fallacy of equivocation. And Aristotle says that's what's happening in Zeno's paradoxes. Again, a little dark humor for the classroom, as I say there on the slide. You can divide me into, the professor, you can divide me into 6 feet heuristically, conventionally, for your purposes of measurement, for your pragmatics with your applied mathematics. But you can't divide me in half even once and have me still be me. Divide me one time and I'm not that organism anymore. Organisms and artifacts can't be divided on Aristotle's view. I think he's right about that. So, and the floor too, if you cut the floor in half, it would be two different things. It wouldn't be the floor anymore. Last bullet point, the reason why that's really key to understanding Aristotle is because Aristotle says, you really have to start with the whole. You have to start, the whole cosmos really is the datum. We'll start from there. And he has these relational theories, for example, of space and time. You start with the surface. You get the surface, you get the place, you get the place, you get space. You get space, you get distance, you get distance, you get motion, you get motion, you get time, and so on. So, and this is also the same structure of the argument that Aristotle will bring to his critique of the atomists, of Democritus. He was very interested in Democritus, who was a major philosopher of the time. So again, the mistake that Democritus is making is the same mistake that Zeno is making, according to Aristotle. That is thinking that the whole is composed of the parts, and that brings us into Aristotle's teleology and so on. I urge you to look into that because it's very good and interesting philosophy. All right, so a just really quick introduction to these Eleatic thinkers, Parmenides and Zeno, with attention to their influence on Greek physics and their influence on Plato and Aristotle. Very important, but also very striking with their paradoxical presentation. Very interesting examples of philosophers, kind of almost a kind of gonzo philosophy, I think, in the case of Zeno. So I hope that's helpful. I tried to make that as brisk as possible. And so now we'll keep on going and look at some more Greek philosophy. Thank you very much.